I'm John Hinkle, the senior pastor of First Presbyterian Church in downtown Murfreesboro, and this is your Saturday morning preview of your Sunday morning sermon, which I'm doing on Friday because that's just when I do this. So this morning, as I reflect on the sermon that I'm about to preach, I've recognized that even though I started out 3 weeks ago saying this wasn't going to be a series of sermons, it really has become a series of sermons of kind of how I see this world around us. If you remember, we started out 3 weeks ago looking at Paul wrestling with that great question of, is it all right for us to eat food that's been sacrificed to idols? And Paul, in that question, makes it very clear that just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean that you necessarily should, especially if your rights become a stumbling block to your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. Last Sunday, we covered in the Gospel of Mark the call of Peter and Andrew when Jesus said, "Come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." And we discovered kind of that elementary truth that we learn best, not necessarily from words on a page, but we learn best by watching people actually do something. You remember in my sermon last Sunday, I said, all of us who we've ever gone fishing, we've gone fishing because we learned how to fish by watching somebody else fish. And it's true for living out the gospel. I mean, we watch Jesus actually love and embrace people who were broken and oppressed. And that's our call too. Well, this Sunday, we're concluding our series of sermons with going back to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he actually kind of gives a lesson on homiletics. And what Paul says about why we preach is for this one reason only. It is about proclaiming the gospel. That's the only reason we preach, is so that the gospel of Jesus Christ is proclaimed. Now, interesting enough, Paul does something really unique here. He basically says it's not just the preacher's job to preach, but we all have a responsibility to proclaim the gospel, right? And we got to remember. So what is the purpose of following Jesus? In last week's sermon, it's what? To become fishermen. And in becoming a fisherman, meaning to fish for people, in proclaiming the gospel, we're called to surrender ourselves in order that we might what? Be a reflection of who Jesus is to this world. But Paul pushes us a little further. Paul says that when he preached to the Jews, he became a Jew. When he preached to the Greeks, he became a Greek. When he preached to the broken, he did so out of his brokenness. What's Paul saying? Paul is saying just as important as in what is in your sermon, meaning Christ crucified, it's also important, and maybe more important, to know who's listening to your sermon. Right? A good example of this, I think it would be that my sermon would probably be wasted if I preached this exact sermon, which I'm going to preach on Sunday, and I preached this exact sermon in Nicaragua, where no one knows English. They only know Spanish, but I'm preaching in English. Well, you see the disconnect? Paul says, listen, you have to become the person you're preaching the sermon to. That's what he did. When he preached to the Jews, he did so out of his Jewishness. When he preached to the Greeks, he did so out of his Greekness, if you will. And why is that important? Well, for this reason. I preach, I'm supposed to preach sermons to those who are in the pews or wherever you're listening to the sermon, not as if our work is done. I preach in order to empower you to go out into this world and fish for people who haven't been called yet. We have been called, all of us. We're okay. We're fine. We get it. But our passion and compassion shouldn't just be for us in the pews. Our passion and compassion needs to be for those in this world. And that's what we're going to explore this